Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Still wrapped in a pandemic. BA5 is exerting its influence. Several billion people are still not vaccinated. It's an overheating planet, and humans are driving that change in the climate system. Humans also have this bad habit of moving into areas that put them in harm's way, or people who have been placed in harm's way through poverty or prejudice. We tend to underappreciate the forces driving losses that we see all around us right now with the epic heat waves underway in Europe, in Britain, and in parts of the United States. I'm Andy Revkin, the Columbia Climate School, coming to you from Penobscot territory in what we now call the state of Maine, my mother-in-law's house. I've moved here to this wonderful state on the coast. We're about 20 degrees, 30 degrees colder Fahrenheit than some of the places that are scorched right now. And I appreciate that New England climate. We're going to talk about a lot of things today. In the second half hour, I'm going to play a clip from Christy Abai, who's one of the world's leading researchers of global environmental health with a focus on heat. And, we need to pay attention right now, no matter what you think about global warming, no matter what you're doing about global warming. If you're not thinking about cutting vulnerability to heat now, especially for those who are most in harm's way, as I just said, then we're going to see worse and worse outcomes. So it's great to have Elon Kelman here, University College London, I believe, who's been on the disaster frontier for several decades, at least a couple decades, studying what makes a disaster and the hazard, which we tend to put in the headlines, fire, heat, is not the disaster. It's what we do or don't do. Elon, it's great to have you on the show. I've written about your work for a long time, way back. and Simon Lee, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Columbia Climate School, but is deeply dug in on the question of what's unfolding right now around us. Maybe we'll start with the climate. Simon, if you want to just give an update on what you see as driving the news today, particularly.
So I'm from the north of England originally, so I'm from a relatively cool part of the UK, or at least somewhere that used to be like that. And so today, for example, I've been receiving photos from my family back home in North Yorkshire of temperatures of 100 Fahrenheit. And this is hard to comprehend. So today is the first day in recorded history that the UK has experienced temperatures of 40 Celsius, and not just at one location, but at multiple locations. So this isn't just an isolated observation site.
Right.
This isn't a dubious reading. This is historic heat for the UK, and this is beating a record for the hottest day set only 3 years ago, which itself beat a record from 2003, which itself beat a record from 1990. And before that, the hottest day for the UK, the record had stood for 79 years. This is orders of magnitude more than anything that the British Isles has seen for probably many thousands of years, given not only the return time on an anomaly of this magnitude in natural climate, but also the fact that we know how hot the global climate is now relative to how hot it has been for many thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And so this is just really hard to get my head around. And I still don't think I quite have really wrapped my head around just how hot it is in England's green and pleasant land.
Amazing. And Elon, you're in England's green and pleasant land. So where are you in London, like in the city?
So I am in London. I'm in Zone 2, the north part of Zone 2. And yes, it is incredibly baking. So I'm working from home, as I've been doing for most of the past 2.5 years. And my employer, University College London, has very kindly, strongly advised us not to come in yesterday or today. We are expecting some cooler weather tomorrow. But last night also set a record for the hottest night that's been recorded in the UK, and tonight may also be rather hot. So we are taking it easy. We are being careful. I have shut my window and balcony door early this morning in order to keep the cooler air in. And when I have stuck my hand outside, it is absolutely baking. I should also note that I do apologize to the audience that this looks like a mantle. And when Andy sent out the call today in order to bring us on board, he was very well balanced and had some absolutely wonderful people
Thank you.
who he asked, including Lisa Schipper. But again, Andy knows what he's
Yeah.
doing, and we're looking forward to hearing from Christy Ebby to ensure
Yeah.
that this whole session is absolutely not just one gender. So again, sorry it looks a bit unbalanced, but it
Yes.
isn't. And we're looking forward to discussing and really hearing from anyone. So thank you.
Yes, and I really appreciate your saying that. It's I try to make this point as much as I can, and I've done sessions with people in slums in Bhopal, informal settlements, and I reached out to the whole world community when the need is there. So you're probably not in an air-conditioned home. There's 95% of Brits don't have air conditioning, right?
So this is one of the challenges of the UK. Certainly in recent history and infrastructural history, air conditioning has not been extensively needed. So no, I do not have air conditioning. I'm fortunate that I'm in a building which does tend to absorb heat in the winter and retain it when it gets cold. But then in the summer, it's not very quick to absorb heat. And again, by keeping the windows and doors shut, it does keep it a bit cool. We're now at 5:10 in the UK, so it is cooling down a bit, but yeah, I am starting to feel it. And it's certainly the next hour or two are going to be tough. I've drunk a lot of water, I'm taking it easy, and just hoping that sleep will be okay tonight. But I deliberately said I'm not having anything scheduled early for this morning or tomorrow morning so I can relax and take it easy. Even in London, there are 11 subway lines, 11 tube lines. Only 4 have air conditioning. And some of the train lines within London are air cooled, they're not air conditioned. And basically what this means is that it is a danger to life to be on those, particularly during the peak periods during rush hour, when people do actually in the summer regularly faint, feel nauseous, and the tube staff know to take measures. But today, at this time, yes, it could be dangerous to life simply because the infrastructure is so old and the country is not used to these sorts of temperatures.
Yeah, and this gets to the vulnerability part that we'll be talking about significantly later in the show. That who is vulnerable, who is most affected by heat, who doesn't have air conditioning. And yet, I showed a minute ago, the United States, basically, it's now over 90%, 95% of the United States households are air conditioned, which is such an extraordinary change. In my book I wrote with my wife in 2018 on the history of humans' relationship with weather and climate, air conditioning was a big one. And it was invented by a guy in Brooklyn, Carrier, early 20s, to stop a humidity problem in a printing plant. And it has changed the world. I wrote more than a decade ago about the what's called sort of anticipated air conditioning demand around the world. You know, Mumbai alone, this is 10 years ago, some estimated had, as the Indian population gets less poor, you know, thriving middle class, the potential demand for air conditioning there is like a quarter of the entire United States use, at least as of about a decade ago. And the lack of it in Portland, Oregon, the great heat dome there, poor people like retirees on limited incomes were turning off their air conditioners because they couldn't afford to pay the electricity, and some of those people died. So all these factors lead the climate vulnerability part. Simon, I thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about the climatological part too. So when you see this unfolding, you have that sense of shock about the extent. Maybe you could talk about the theories about what's going on here. I know some colleagues at Columbia studying the jet stream. And there's this basic principle illustrated here beautifully by Climate Central that, you know, if you warm the whole climate system, those extremes tend to become a more plentiful part of the curve. So just take us through the science. You know, the Sahara plays a role, the jet stream. What's the best sense of what's going on? And CO2.
So the weather event, I think it's interesting to think about this starting from the weather event. So the weather event that we have is really what gets referred to as a plume event in Western Europe, whereby what you typically have is a cut-off low to the west of Portugal or thereabouts, and strong warm advection from the Sahara through Spain, through France, and up towards the UK as associated with that. And typically this weather pattern is what is associated with bringing the UK its hottest day of the year, because the UK is really further north than 50 north, I think is its most southerly latitude. It's very far north, exceptional to get this sort of heat at that latitude without some sort of imported air mass. So that's the way in which you get toward those extremes. But then what's happened now, obviously, is completely obliterated all the previous records, and really kind of means we have to recalibrate what we think when we think about the hottest day of the year in the UK. And it also means that maps which look like scary future climate projections aren't anymore, because they're just what the weather is like this week. And this has been multiplied not only, of course, because the global climate is hotter, but because we really had kind of perfect storm conditions. There's drought in Western Europe, including parts of the UK, so the soil moisture is exceptionally low, so more of the incoming solar radiation can be converted to sensible heat as opposed to latent heat from evaporation. And that's a really key driver of the most extreme heat waves in Europe, and certainly something which is a prerequisite for extreme heat in the UK, which is typically somewhere that a lot of people think of as being very, very wet, but is in fact experienced several prolonged periods of low rainfall in recent years, and this is just the latest one, and that's an ongoing concern for parts of the UK. So I think that's the precursor drought is very important. Obviously the synoptic weather pattern is important. And there's also been a recent study which was co-authored by Kai Kornhuber, also from Columbia, that suggested that an increased frequency of a specific jet stream configuration involving split jets was actually leading to Europe being really a heatwave hotspot for the global climate. And that's your second order effect, where you have a dynamical change that's actually multiplicative on top of the background thermodynamic change, which I think is deeply overlooked, and probably the thing that, if we are not quite capturing this in modeling scenarios, that's probably why, because the dynamics are difficult to resolve.
At that scale, right. This has been one of the challenges for a long time with climate models. Are there any other spots in the world that have that hotspot kind of quality? I don't have the paper up in front of me. I actually interviewed him not long ago about that.
So there's this idea of, if you get a specific jet stream configuration, you can have recurrent heat waves across different parts of Europe and Asia and North America simultaneously, and that's certainly consistent with what we're seeing at the moment. But just to briefly go back to the modeling perspective, from a forecasting perspective, I think we've really seen how certainly the land surface is a really key component. Between certain different forecast models, the way they were representing land surface moisture, just something as simple as that, was having a huge impact on whether they were predicting a new record maximum, but not something of Pacific Northwest heatwave style extreme, or that level of extreme. That's something very fundamental in these models, was just the amount of moisture they had in the surface. The ones that went perhaps too dry, like the American GFS model, was predicting temperatures which were higher than what we've seen, but actually has somehow ended up quite close to giving a long lead time forewarning of this event by actually being biased too hot. Whereas other models weren't evaporating enough moisture from their land surface, and so were biased cold. So I think that really does highlight how something just as easy, well, it's not to trivialize the scale of the problem, but just as straightforward as that land surface interaction is so important for really representing heat waves of this magnitude.
So now let's take this from that reality of the climate dynamics creating these sort of bullseyes on the map. I've had Stephen Strader on here before, who's a geographer who works with Walker Ashley, and they talk about an expanding bullseye. This is Elon's territory, where we're putting more people in places that face hazards. Columbia, another team at Columbia, this is that same group, Columbia and elsewhere, Potsdam, I think, as well. They've created an interactive map showing the exposure to extreme heat, which is what's happening is these zones of extreme heat are expanding, and people are flooding into areas like whether it's Arizona or parts of the Middle East or India. We're kind of getting in harm's way. So Elon, that can create a sense of confusion for some. Well, I thought this was a global warming crisis. How do you untangle, how do you lead folks through a decision-making process that captures both that climatic reality and what seems like it seems like a nutty habit we have of moving to places that, as Pierce Lewis, the historian, in the context of flooding, he called Louisiana, like New Orleans, he called it impossible and inevitable. So, but that's all around the world. We're moving into places that are impossible but inevitable. So how do you untangle this for folks?
Yeah, this goes back to basic disaster science, and it also then leads to the exceptionality of human-caused climate change. So fundamentally in disasters, weather does not cause a disaster. We have the knowledge, we have the understanding to survive hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, landslides. And yet, New Orleans isn't a dangerous place, but it also has a vibrant culture, it has a wonderful history, and it contributes so much to the world. So living below sea level in a hurricane zone is not in and of itself a really stupid thing to do. We're not advocating for evacuating New Orleans or moving the entire city, because we have the wealth and we have the knowledge and technical expertise to ensure that people do not die when the Mississippi River floods or when a hurricane comes through. And it's the same anywhere, whether it's London dealing with northeast sea storm surge, whether it's some of those dots on the map, even dealing with heat outside of human-caused climate change. Deaths and disasters come from people who are forced to be poor, forced to be marginalized, forced to not have choices or resources or power. So this is why we say disasters are not natural. This is why we say there's no such thing as a black swan, because we can understand why people cannot deal with heat, cold, flood, landslides, or weather. And if we wanted to put the resources available to it, we could help them. But we are now surpassing a threshold, and this is where human-caused climate change creates some exceptions, but they are the terrifyingly lethal exceptions that we are seeing now, which are starting to dominate, particularly heat and humidity. So as human beings, we have certain limits to survivability. And above certain heat, humidity, time combinations, we're dead. If you're an outdoor agricultural laborer, if you're a construction worker, if you just continue working in these levels of heat and humidity, then we're going to see high mortality. And there's really nothing that we can do. So a typical heat wave, just take it easy. Relax. Maybe you can go to a cooling center, or we can make air conditioning affordable, but air conditioning is energy intensive, so that's not great. In Chicago 95 heat wave, in the Europe 2003 heat wave, yes, we saw hundreds dead in Chicago, tens of thousands dead in Europe, but that was due to social isolation. That was due to fear of crime, not wanting to go outside, not realizing that you were overheating. Now, it doesn't matter what you do. When we get to 4, 5, 6 days above 40 degrees Celsius with humidity, then you have to have artificial cooling to survive. And if we're going to stop farming for this length of time, if we're going to stop construction for this length of time, what happens to our materials? What happens to our food? So this is where human-caused climate change creates this difference between weather never causing disasters, its vulnerability, through to the fact that us changing the weather to be lethal, actually we do have to avoid that change in order to avoid the disaster. So there are other exceptions, but the one we are seeing now is heat humidity. It was identified in British Columbia last year in July. It was India, Pakistan in April and May. And now Southern Europe and the UK are experiencing it. So this disaster is obviously still not natural because we are causing the heat humidity. It is still not a black swan because scientists have been saying we are going to experience these sorts of heat waves. They've been telling us for decades, and now it's here. Over 1,000 people are already dead from the heat in Europe, and it will be a while before we can tally the full number of deaths.
Right. I mentioned in my story today, the Los Angeles Times last fall did an epic series with epidemiologists in the room that found that the California state estimate for mortality from heat for the last 10 years The real figure was about 5 times higher. So it was like 600 was the official tally, and it was like, I think it was, well, I could look it up. It was many times higher.
Even in London, the 2003 heat wave and the one subsequent to that, the estimate is about 20% of the deaths can be attributed to human-caused climate change. And around the UK, we're typically looking at 2,000 to 3,000 heat-related deaths per year. If the current trajectory continues, by the 2050s, that will almost triple.
So I'm going to play a clip, and then I can stop it periodically for your thoughts. This was, make sure this works okay. I'm on my mother-in-law's internet. It's actually better than the internet at my house.
It's great to be with Christy Ebby again. Is that how you pronounce it right? I want to make sure.
So just to get the context, Christy Ebby, she corrects me. She's at the University of Washington. She was a lead author of the 2018 1.5 degree report from the IPCC climate panel. She's dug in deeply on the interface between climate science and health policy. And she was in Seattle through the epic Pacific Northwest heat spell, the heat storm. And I had her on. This is actually recorded last July, not long after they had that heat spell. So that's the context. But everything she says is relevant right now. And thanks, by the way, if either of you have to get off, let me know. But I'm going to stop it periodically and we can talk about it.
Ebi, actually.
Ebi, that's right. For many years I assumed it was Ebby. I don't know why.
Well, okay. That's how you pronounce it in Europe, or parts of Europe you pronounce it that way. But okay. It's Ebi.
And you're at the University of Washington.
I'm at the University of Washington.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here we go. I'm Andy Revkin, longtime climate-focused journalist, sustainability-focused communicator at Columbia University, and great to be back with Christy Ebby, who's dug in about as deep as anybody I know on the interface between global climate change and public health. And she's worked at this really hard at the local scale in the Northwest and at the global scale, both through her work in Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports and a lot of other research. You guys just went through a phenomenon that will be much more part of the weather forecasts coming in the future. These terms come and go. There was a point when polar vortex was kind of new, at least in the weather newscasts, and now it's something everyone thinks about. And heat domes and the word record are emerging as a new normal. And I know we have talked about that phrase. So let's talk a little bit about general principles that emerge as you think about what has just happened there, what's still happening there in terms of tallying costs, losses, and lives and the like for the world generally going forward. And I'd like to start with just what to me I think is the biggest general challenge in covering climate change for 33 years. I see everyone, including me, struggling with multiple messages. How do you focus on cutting emissions and cutting risk on the ground at the same time and make both of those urgent? So you must have your own sort of approach or rigor when you think about that, because unless you disagree, but it's sort of a hard thing to do to me.
It's a good question, and it is a challenge that we have to work on both scales. We have to work on the short term on adaptation. We're certainly going to have to work on adaptation on the longer term as well. But looking into the future, we need to also ensure we cut our emissions. I work in public health, and it is somewhat easier from the public health perspective because, for example, you go and talk to your doctor, and your doctor says you need to do some things pretty immediately, and you need to do some things for your longer term health. And putting it in that context of what we need to do in the short and the long term to protect our future health, the health of our children, our friends, our colleagues, and of future generations.
Kirk Smith, who I'm sure you knew, who passed away sadly in the past year, he was one of my go-to people on the general question of public health. And he was constantly sifting through data and finding the burdens of disease. And they're all in the data. And you can't point to any person and say, that stroke was from indoor air pollution, but it's there. And he always bemoaned how we focus on the symptoms, meaning you go to the doctor when you're sick. He said public health is about preventing sickness. It's like he called doctors the failure people. He said, no, we all need them. He said, but the Kirk Smith, doctors are the failure people. And it's like, if you're not dealing with the forces driving risk, you're doomed. And is that part of the challenge? Like when you stay up late at night wondering about a better path, is part of this that public health is sort of in the numbers?
Public health is part of the solutions. There's lots that can be done with public health in terms of the solutions, both the adaptation and the mitigation. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of this heat wave for all communities to think about, are you really prepared for something so far outside of your experience? And how do you go about setting those up? These are essentially a whole of government activity. You think about, for example, setting up cooling centers. Where are they located? Are they near the most vulnerable? Do you know where the most vulnerable are located? How are they going to get there? Are you going to ask vulnerable people to go out and walk to a bus stop, wait for the bus and take a bus? Right. How long are you going to have it open? How are you going to deal with low-income housing? How are you going to deal with red line districts? So you start thinking about all of the groups that need to be engaged. And it's not that it's difficult. It takes organization, it takes commitment, it takes a whole of government approach. And then on the other side, on the mitigation in the US, our healthcare is responsible for 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot that needs to be done from the side of our health systems to reduce our own emissions and make sure that we're not contributing to future health problems.
One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about the COVID-19 pandemic and climate risk, one thing that seems clear to me is that for reducing vulnerability or identifying and acting on vulnerability to heat, there is something that for everyone to do, meaning if you remember the work of Kleinenberg, Eric, on the Chicago heat wave, and knowing where the elderly grandmother is in a high floor of a tenement is a vital part of reducing exposure to hazard being extreme heat. And that feels like a still undervalued opportunity. So how much of that part, and we'll get to the mitigation, do you feel is like a frontier that we're not really fully invested in yet?
I fully agree with you. When you look at the investments in our research enterprise, they're around identifying when do you decide it's a heat wave. They're not identifying how do we communicate to people that you are at risk. That if you're in a wide variety of categories, you're at higher risk. And these are the kinds of actions that you need to take to protect yourself. And the actions that you can take to protect that elderly grandmother that lives next door, checking in to make sure that she's okay. So it does start with us as individuals, and then of course needs to flow up to our communities and to our agencies.
So having in advance kind of a vulnerability map can help you do that.
Having an advanced vulnerability map would be very helpful. Having more research on how we can effectively communicate to people that they are at risk and they need to make a change. If you think about the messaging over the years for tobacco smoke and all the different approaches that were taken until the research came in, and there are particular approaches that work with certain age groups. And we need the same thing. We need people to understand that, yes, you're a runner. Yes, you go out every day at 3 p.m. And no, please don't do it today. It's not, it's just not safe. It's hazardous, even if you're healthy.
Right. Just to give you a quick example of how this is working elsewhere, there are two geographers, Stephen Strader and Walker Ashley, who have done this body of work under the rubric of expanding bullseye. essentially they map exposure more than vulnerability in sort of hurricane zones or wildfire zones. And they were getting to the point when Florence was hitting the Carolinas several years back. Steve Strader had posted on Twitter a map showing very briefly how much building had happened in floodplains in the last few decades. So it was like a heat map for risk. And I was asking at that time, well, can we normalize in a weather forecast? We're not just saying hurricane category 3 is approaching, but hurricane category 3 is approaching. And here are the areas we know are really in danger because these houses were only built, 20 years ago in places that are totally vulnerable. So, and there's a conversation still I'm trying to kind of tame and figure out where the action points are that could create a forecast that has some of that specificity. It feels like it's there. The data are there. Of course, you have to have geographers talking to emergency management people, talking to climate people. So is that, we talked about frustrations and challenges, but is that exciting to you? Does this feel like a place where you really can make some progress?
So I'm going to pause it there and bring my guests back because, hold on. Could you hear it pretty well?
Yes, I had no problem hearing it and seeing it.
Okay. So a lot of what we were just talking about relates to your work on disaster risk reduction. It's one thing to identify risk. It's another thing to build responsiveness, trust, and a sense of where to go, depending on who you are. Maybe you could both weigh in a little bit on that. You're both, Simon, you're very active on Twitter, so you're obviously interested in communication. Elon, for a long time, we've talked about this question. So what are your thoughts on what's been said so far?
Go ahead, Simon.
So I have a fairly good experience now from the last 4 or so years of trying to communicate global heating from in a Twitter perspective and trying to come up with new ways of visualizing that. So in the UK, one of the most prolonged heat waves, albeit not nearly as hot as what we've been seeing recently, occurred in 1976. And so there's a very common British thing of people of a certain age and personality to say, we survived in 1976. This is all a load of hot air, pun intended. And of course, trivializing the fact that people died in 1976, there was a massive water shortage, and it's not to be trivialized. So in 2018, during the heat wave, I came up with this idea of putting the NASA GISS global temperature anomaly maps for 1976 and 2018 next to each other to kind of say, this is, if you threw a dart, you'd be very unlikely to hit an area of hot weather in 1976, whereas in 2018, this would be much easier to do. And that was a really, really successful, exactly that. That was a really successful tweet. And the, excuse me, the idea has got out way beyond anything I could keep track of, and has been replicated since. And there's an example now for 2022. And so in response to that, obviously I got a lot of people saying the kind of traditional climate denialist style comments. But I think what was really heartening was that people said to that, now I understand it. I did see people say that. And so that's always motivated me to come up with new ways of trying to visualize the situation that we're in. There's another recent tweet that I put out where I showed the distribution of temperatures in the UK and what constitutes normal summer weather, and then where we are in this extreme tail of the distribution and how we've seen that shift. And so I believe very strongly in kind of, you could say, activism through data, in the sense that I still don't believe that people quite, because we as climate scientists, we sit and look at the data all day. These things are familiar to us. The 1976 versus 2018 maps was something that I didn't even realize would blow people's minds, in a sense, because we're just used to that. And so I do believe very strongly in just constantly hammering home new ways of saying, no, look, this is where we are, because people aren't really exposed to that day to day like we are. And we can become kind of numb to something like this, like 40 Celsius on that distribution is 5 standard deviations. It's a 5 sigma event, notwithstanding the fact that the distribution's a bit skewed. But, that's mind-boggling. And so my the role that I'd like to think that I've got here is just to say to Twitter and to use Twitter to that end, and I constantly try and engage with anyone who's saying any kind of ridiculous response to these tweets, to show that we have responses to those things. We're not being scared and frightened and thinking that people have got a gotcha to climate science. That the reality of the situation is as bad as we've been saying for a very, very long time.
Yeah. And I've had sessions on here. I did one with Ed Hawkins and Alex Radke, who've been working hard on using stripes that indicate the historic weather, climate, temperature trends, and what could go on in the future. I did have on Ulrika Hahn, who's a PhD studying art and climate, and she did a literature review, and so far there's hardly any literature to indicate whether any of this works. Are we just preaching to the converted, or are we just doing sort of meme battle with a small cluster of like-minded antagonists? I mean, you know what I mean? Opposite-minded antagonists. There was a guy, a member of parliament, was tweeting yesterday about, well, the Brits go on holiday to, and he had a list of places they go where it's 42 degrees all the time. And I guess I worry about that sometimes, you know. So Elon, what do you think about that? You know, looking at the whole communication sphere and what matters and doesn't matter.
We also had a member of parliament saying that people who were worried about this level of heat are snowflakes. And it was actually good to see him thinking about science, because in this level of heat, snowflakes are going to melt and snowflakes are going to die, because that's the reality. It's hard. And I think that what you said from Ulrike is absolutely right. We don't fully know the evidence. What we do know, we can move forward with. So for me, science communication is not about me as a supposed brilliant expert telling these ignorant masses what they need to know. Instead, it's a conversation, a dialogue, a multilogue, because people communicate differently and people respond differently. It cannot be one way. It cannot be only one mode. Some people are visual, and what Simon has presented is brilliant. So clear, so obvious, so straightforward to those who are visual. Others are different. Not everyone uses Twitter, and it is a medium to reach a good proportion of people, but not everyone, and so we have to think about other modes, other ways of communicating. Fundamentally, it is about listening. So because people are different and audiences are different, I do spend a lot of time saying, look, what works for you? Do you want a tweet? Do you want a blog? Do you want a 10,000 word paper? Do you want a 40,000 word book? Do you want to ask me questions and I answer? Do you want me to lecture to you for 4.5 hours and then walk away? So people learn differently and respond differently. The other aspect is recognizing that we do have many successes as well as failures of risk communication. So certainly in the places where the three of us are now, and also where Chris is, you cannot smoke indoors in public places. It took a generation to get there, but the risk communication worked. Same with seatbelt laws. Same with many other day-to-day, everyday risks, some of which still exist in many countries and some of which we have tried to get rid of and done well. So can we learn from those, including, for example, what we did to deal with the stratospheric ozone layer and the international treaty that was developed there, as well as the differences with current issues, and really working out why often communication drives people to polar opposites and why sometimes it brings them together. Why some people do not learn through the written word and some do not learn through the spoken word. Art is incredibly powerful. And I'm working with one project called Land Body Ecologies. So Land Body Ecologies, you can search for that, where scientists and artists working together to understand and communicate local experiences of what climate change is doing. My employer, UCL Culture, has just given me 2 small grants to work with artists to communicate these messages. One is we're trying to avoid the doomerism, the eco-grief, eco-anxiety, and seeing how we can develop artistically based on science, messages of eco-inspiration. And yes, that's land body ecology. Thank you for bringing that up. So we have one hub in London, other hubs in other countries. And we're hoping to use science for artistic communication of eco-inspiration. Another one is going to produce a short show about how we are taking colonialism, post-colonialism, exploitation, extraction to the moon. So rather than using outer space as a venue to bring together people and to say, let's improve the way we approach our day-to-day lives in our millennium to millennium activities, unfortunately, a lot is really going into moon mining, moon extraction, and similar. Will they work? We don't know, but we are going to evaluate it. And I do want Simon to continue this brilliant work through Twitter, through the visuals, and on all your other public engagement. Andy, you've been phenomenal. Again, just look at your Twitter, right? Look at your LinkedIn and all the work you did at the New York Times and beyond. But we also need feedback from everyone listening on how we can do better, whether you use Twitter, whether you use StreamYard, whether you want one-on-ones, whether you want more mass production. Can we write for you? Can we speak for you? And how can we best convey these messages so that the people who we are not reaching respond respectfully and constructively, and we can all learn and do better and move forward in that manner? You're muted, Andy.
Yeah, the dog was barking.
Okay.
If we have a little more time, let me play a little bit more of the interview with Christy, and we can get to some of these other ideas. I think you're spot on with what you've been saying. Hold on here.
I've been advocating for this for heat wave early warning systems for years. We have so much information about who is at higher risk. And what I have, I'm old enough, I watch my broadcast meteorologist. And to be unfair to them, what you have is a broadcast meteorologist tell us it's hot. But we don't start saying 3 days before the heat wave starts, if you're over the age of 65, if you have these underlying health conditions, if you work outdoors, you need to take extra caution. And people, as we said before, who check in on those most vulnerable, start thinking in advance. We can apply that geographically as well. We know that many of our red line districts in the US are hotter than the neighboring areas because they've got fewer trees. If you lived in the red line district, this is the temperature in the city. In your particular neighborhood, it's going to be much hotter. And yes, we've got the information. It hasn't been brought together into an operational system.
Yeah, and you think about the advances in weather forecasting in terms of the European model. There's this big competition between the models on these exact kind of events, and you see Jeff Barradelli and some other leaders in the area finding ways to integrate some of this, but it's still not an action. You're right. It's about the local weather forecaster and or emergency management folks providing real granular, here's what to do. And there's no excuse in the sense that as the forecast for this, well, actually, do you recall how early on this heat storm or heat dome was clearly going to hit? There was a point many days ahead of time when it looked like it was possible. I don't know what the details were.
It was several days in advance. And from my perspective, having worked on these issues for 20 plus years, it was a textbook case of you've got the forecast, in a region that's not prepared. It has lots of strengths here, lots of capacities in the region. And in the first day or two of a heat wave, we know it takes 24 hours before you start seeing deaths. And you don't get that information immediately. So in the first couple of days, it doesn't look like it's so bad. And then suddenly you've got all kinds of people coming into the emergency department. You've got deaths coming in. And trying to stand up a system that includes this whole of government approach really is very, very difficult to do in a couple of days. Our cities did put up cooling centers. Portland ran into special problems because their rail system, the city rail system, was shut down.
Right.
The metal was starting to deform or could deform. And so you do have to do this in advance. And yes, it's very doable to set up a tiered system, to think about how to ensure that you reach out, including to the homeless, who we also know are at very high risk, and how to help protect people, because all of these deaths, almost all of these deaths, are preventable. We don't have to have people die in heat waves. It is around our preventive activities and how well we can implement those.
I think you muted, Andy.
Sorry, yeah, she's made that point over and over again. She said very straightforwardly one day, nobody needs to die in a heat wave. And it felt kind of jarring when she said it, but the more we dug in, the more you realize, perhaps with a few exceptions, it's really true. That if you have community awareness, again, like Eric Kleinenberg's work showed in Chicago in 1995, if you have a church community that knows where the old people are, then you know where the vulnerability is. So, but then she said, and you both have said, now we're in new terrain. The climate change is driving, for heat particularly, the hazard into new regions and to new heights. And I just do worry that at the same time, heat has this amorphous quality, and even the media, as you know, Saffron O'Neill has been making this point over and over again. We don't know how to tell the story even with pictures. She's done work that shows that we're too often reaching for happy pictures of people slaking their thirst at a bar by the beach and not doing the harder work.
But even so, I'm careful on some of that communication, because the phrase climate breakdown is actually nonsensical and distracts from the fundamentals. Climate is a statistical property. As such, it has mathematically chaotic properties, that is its nature, and it does not break down per se. It changes radically, we are changing it. But if we suddenly get into this bizarre realm of climate breakdown and climate chaos, we're actually miscommunicating, and we're misrepresenting the science. We're distracting from these baselines of vulnerability, and we're distracting from the fact that we are pushing this statistical property into a realm which for the Earth is not much of an issue, but for us, it is frighteningly destructive. So this, again, is very much part of the communication. How can we focus on the basics? How can we get the baseline out there without succumbing to this unscientific rhetoric and phrases which are really meaningless?
So Simon, Extinction Rebellion there and several groups here have been pushing the case for climate emergency, using language that does tend to make it seem like it's the monster is out there, and not so much these are the things you can do to cut risk even while we cut emissions. I don't know how that plays in your mind as a numbers person.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear you pick up, Elon, on that headline, because the phrase also frustrates me. And so one of the things I like to do is to listen to what contrarians and deniers and all sorts of people like that, what they're picking up on. And it seems like a large part of it nowadays is things like this, is phrasing like climate breakdown and related phrasing, or the way certain things are exaggerated beyond what the science can support in some of the wider media. And admittedly, they're doing it with good intent, which is great. But I think we do have to be concerned that we don't fall down that hole whilst trying to climb another mountain. And I think that's actually one of our biggest challenges right now, because the more the concern grows amongst us, and I know that we all feel very rationally but also emotionally about this, because it's our future, it's our families, children's futures, it's society's future, that we don't drift to hyperbole and things that don't make sense.
Yeah, or that don't, right, that just sort of too often I see just the static kind of push me, pull you phenomenon, where we're not engaged in telling people, well, here are the things you can do to cut risk. I sense that some of this is about a lot of my environmentalist friends are so focused on mitigating the emissions that they miss the opportunities there are to mitigate, that's my wife, to mitigate risk right now. In other words, you can get people out of vulnerable situations right now and work on cutting emissions. They both are really important. The one of them can actually save lives right now, whereas the other is really about reducing that statistical nudge for the future. And
a key point on that is they do not oppose each other. They complement each other, and doing them simultaneously is the way forward. And it is really awful to see some of the scientists who call themselves public communicators go out with technocratic solutions, saying that it's all about long-term emission reductions, and then using really odd, bizarre buzzwords like a holistic resilience of society or social ecological systems or transformative adaptation, which as a scientist, they mean nothing to me. I can't imagine how the general public responds. And it really is exactly what you're saying, Andy. Let's stop our consumption or reduce our consumption, which will help reduce emissions at the same time as helping people immediately, showing compassion, showing caring, showing helping each other and helping ourselves, because it really is about melding the hour to hour that I'm seeing out the window right now in London with the day-to-day right through to the century to century and millennium to millennium. And by focusing on people, by focusing on vulnerability, we then bring together these two jargonistic words, mitigation and adaptation. We stop the separation and we deal with all of the difficult societal ills simultaneously, helping everyone to help ourselves.
That all sounds pretty good to me. I think we could do two things at once, maybe three or four, if we really get our heads around it. Especially
particularly
because
when
they're
we support each other and complement each other.
Exactly, as opposed to.
Sorry, I think one of the things which sometimes gets lost is that it's all well and good talking about emissions reductions, but we're not reversing where we're going. We're in a dialogue talking about kind of plateauing at something that's worse than where we are now for some degree of time in the future. So there has to be a sense of adapting and dealing with that other side of it, because that is our reality no matter what we do. And we've only really, this has been something that's been on my mind recently. We're because we're changing the climate so fast, we don't have kind of the ability to experience all the possibilities that the current climate can bring us. And that's particularly true of extremes because they're rare. So we really kind of almost don't know.
So hopefully there'll be a case study or something that will emerge.
That's all right.
I didn't mean for that. I didn't mean for that to start playing right away. Christy says something really important about this. She bridles at the idea of a new normal. I just have to find it. Let me just see if we can.
Good for her. Another terrible phrase, the new normal.
Because, let me just see if I can find
it. This reminds me of talk about forward-looking efforts, and then we'll talk about mitigation. And when we had our chat the last time with Vivek Chandas from Portland State, he showed this really interesting dynamic map. It's basically a map of two futures for Portland, and this is forward-looking, and you can see there's paving. It's a rough sketch because it's really just a yes/no paved green analysis that took a lot of computer time. And what it shows you here is, the difference between a green surface and a paved surface going forward in time. And I would love to think that any community, knowing that heat domes aren't specific to Portland or the Northwest, this phenomenon will be becoming more normalized, sadly. Even with cutting emissions, how do we fit this into our planning? So, it relates to what we were saying about disaster planning, having heat get into that arena, so that you're not scurrying to put up cooling centers, right at the day of the thing. When you think about the next couple of decades, the cities are planning right now how to address the issues that redlining analysis has shown, or is this part of the process yet, or do you feel this is still early days too? Looking
This
at the
is part
future.
of the process. Let me, sorry.
That's okay.
That
So is this part of is this there yet, or could it be even better articulated going forward?
this is coming. There's many cities that are developing heat action plans, and the heat action plans are exactly what you're talking about. Our future is going to be hotter. We're going to have more heat waves. What are we going to do about our infrastructure? How do we think about our regulations? Are we going to require new buildings to have some kind of green or white roof? What are we going to do about planting trees? That all goes into your long-term planning, taking into account that it's in our hands whether we have a future with more trees or a future with more asphalt.
Right. And there's so many other aspects of that in terms of
So I
Give me a second.
reduction, part of the message that you try to
change, and seeing a real shift as a consequence of that. My bias, of course, is you need to have the science to inform what is underneath the messaging, but it's not necessarily that the scientists are the best messengers. We do need more doctors coming out. Doctors have a lot of credibility. There's many doctors very concerned about climate change. And having ways for all of these voices to come forward is really, really helpful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the webcasts I did back in December was with Kim Stanley Robinson, the Cli-Fi writer extraordinaire, whose new book is Ministry for the Future. But I had him in a conversation with Alexandria Villaseñor, who's 14, and the way I described this conversation was she is the future. In other words, she's the one living in this world of changed risk, changing, ever-changing heat. And he had written this extraordinary, his new book is a sprawling and very challenging book about a time when global warming has already taken hold, when his opening section, the opening passage was about a wet bulb, a great die-off in India from a wet bulb event of over 35 degrees. And it was getting hotter, is the first line. But what was really powerful was the conversation. And also in the conversation was Carolyn Raffensperger, who's a lawyer who 10 years ago I wrote about. She was proposing that the future needs a legal guardian. And it's that conversation that then I think stimulates, hopefully, something someone can do at the local scale, at the community scale, and through activism or innovation or changing your career path as a young person, which I think is I haven't seen that on the lists of things to do. You can actually change your career. You can become a social scientist. You can become an emergency management forecaster and the like. So that's what gives me hope. It's the crosstalk that leads to these kinds of the spread of good ideas. The last thing that comes to mind for me is that the properties you would want in a community that gives it that awareness of the old person who's vulnerable and whose air conditioner is broken are the same about properties you'd want in a community for 1,000 other reasons.
Yeah.
That most of those skills are useful across issues. And that gives me hope too. So it sounds like you're overall hopeful-ish.
I'm a worried optimist. And I agree with you. I teach, and the number of students interested in this issue grows every year. And their commitment, their real interest in working on climate change as an issue,
I think we're getting
means
to the
we
point.
have a large number of people coming up who will bring creativity, innovation, will help with developing new technologies. And you're right of thinking about the communities we want to live in. One of the many nice things about living in Seattle is every other year, the city awards Green Globe Awards. to a dozen or so individuals and organizations who are working towards sustainability. And they have this lovely public recognition for this. And how nice for a community to do that, to celebrate what is going on within that community that is bringing higher social capital, helping building the future of the community. And so there's many positive things that communities can do besides developing heat action plans, which are important and save lives, but they can also do celebratory kinds of activities that get everybody engaged.
Great. Well, Christy, it's been great to talk with you again. And stay cool.
I think there was one more.
Dimensions of
Hold
risk
on.
over.
I don't know, could be much longer month in which the global mean surface temperature.
Here we go. Yeah. So she's talking
So
about
thinking forward.
She skips to discussing the role of this emerging generation, young people who've never known normal, in getting us through here. Let me just see if I got it queued up. Sorry about the delay.
What does it look like to understand how to address a future that is dynamically changing, and not only that, has multiple dimensions of risk overlapping? If it isn't, what's the opposite of stationarity? you know, managing change, I guess, but is there a word for that?
There isn't a word for that, but let me add something for you to think about. And I've not looked up the numbers for quite some time because of COVID. We've all been distracted. But the Earth is in the 160th, I don't know, could be much longer month in which the global mean surface temperature is above the long-term average. And if you work that backwards, somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s, that since then, all the people born around that time and born since then have never seen normal. That my kids were born in 1987, and they don't know what normal is. We're old enough that we can think back when we were kids about what summers used to look like. We've got expectations. We know there's variability, but we have this internal knowledge about summers, and we often revert to, when we're talking about climate change, oh well, there's variability, but it's going to go back to this particular state, which is called normal. And the kids coming up don't know what that is. And so they're bringing a perspective that is a little challenging to understand, because I don't know that experience of never seeing a normal summer or a normal winter. And thinking, as you said, going forward, of how do we continue to manage change in multiple dimensions. Humans, by and large, are not very good at this. We're not very good at looking into the future and talking with futurists, talking with others, of reimagining a world that does have a lot of change, but the magnitude and pattern of that change is in our hands. And having people have the sense of the power that they have for determining their own future, as well as the future of everybody around them.
That's a great point. So we're raising a generation from here forward where essentially we are in a state with no new normal.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully some set of properties or capacities in individuals and communities, and maybe at the global scale, can emerge. And it sounds like it would emerge best from that cohort of people who are most familiar with the state. Is that a good way of summing things up?
I agree with you that people like us who worked in climate change a long time have a sense about this, but when talking about the general population, it is going to come from this group that has seen nothing but change, and having them come forward with the language that's going to resonate with how they're going to think about their future, how they want to advocate for the kinds of changes they would like to see.
So thank you for your patience, and the full conversation is just remarkable. This point, I have this watchwords series I'm doing on my webcasts and on my writing. And what I watchwords are words that deserve a second look, or words that are confusing people, or words that people misuse actively. There are many of them. And new normal, I think, has to be on the list. So just again, I know you've been here for a while with me. It's hot, and even in New York. And so thank you for being here today. If you had any final go forth words for folks who, not just who's listening now, but who will be tuning into this later when I update the post and stuff, what would that be? So maybe Simon, a parting thought for people as they are bake in Europe and we confront these trajectories and understandings.
Well, first, I want to thank you for having me. And yes, I did turn off my AC in order to not have it buzzing in this meeting. So it is now about well over 80 Fahrenheit in my apartment. So it is at least some insight, but still pales in comparison, to be honest, about what most people are going through in non-air conditioned parts of Western Europe.
Yeah.
I think really what we've ended the discussion on is kind of would have been my takeaway, is that people are perhaps thinking that certain things are normal that aren't, because they just haven't known anything better. And it was a point I've been trying to make a few times in some of the climate graphics that I've made, was that, people born after a certain time in the UK, they don't know what a cold UK summer is. Last summer in the UK, people describe that as a cold summer, and it's nowhere near a cold summer relative to what used to happen. In fact, what makes it weird is it's the only summer since 2019 where the UK hasn't seen 100 Fahrenheit, which of course itself was once unprecedented, to use a word which I see in your word cloud there.
Right.
So I think that's a really important point to take home, is that people are really not going to know. And this is obviously an ongoing issue. It's surreal to think that people who are at age 18 now were born after the summer 2003 heat wave. That was something they would have read about as a historical event. And I think that's important that we remember that, because we're drifting further away from what that was. And I think that's a key thing to take home. And of course, will only amplify through time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here, Simon. And we'll revisit some of these things. Hope to have you back on. And Elon,
Absolutely.
your takeaway here, take forward here, not take away.
To also echo my thanks. It's been wonderful, Andy. Appreciate your work, and so exciting to see what Simon is doing, which contributes a lot. There's been excellent comments and questions in the chat, which is showing good engagement. And so wonderful to hear from Chris, who is just so knowledgeable. I think the final takeaway is her phrase, worried optimist. Mm-hmm. This is serious, but we can be optimistic. We should be optimistic. We know what to do. We have the resources, we have the techniques. So it is about us coming together, not being over anxious, not going into climate grief or the word solastalgia, but instead recognizing that worry is appropriate. It is dangerous, it is serious, it is difficult. It's not going to be easy, but there is so much inspiration and hope for the future if we come together and do it. So take Chris's advice, be a worried optimist, and join us in communicating, but more importantly, in acting. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you both for being here today. Elon Kelman at University College London, Simon Lee, Columbia University Climate School. And wherever you are, it's kind of like on the airplane when you have to put on your own oxygen first. So make sure you're cool and safe, and then get out there in the neighborhood and understand who right down the block. I think too many people think about the vulnerability thing as something out there. I wrote in 2007 a New York Times special report on the climate divide, and it was all about India and Malawi versus the United States and Australia. And I hadn't yet fully integrated the understanding that the vulnerability is also right down the block. Here in Maine, elderly people, fixed incomes, if any income, struggling in the winter and in the summer. And we can all do something there that builds a thriving, interconnected community and that can face the challenges ahead, which will not be easing anytime soon. Thanks all for being here today. This is the Columbia Climate School Sustain What webcast. I'm Andy Revkin. As soon as we're done, look at the link. You can get in touch with me with that through that scrolling bar at the bottom, has all the information you need. And as soon as we're done, this gets archived on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter to take it forward. Be well.